This is Chelsea Perkins, a US Coast Guard veteran better known as Selena Savage. On the surface, Chelsea seemed like a woman with an unusual path. A former service member turned mother and then eventually OnlyFans model. And whether you agree with her lifestyle or not, she knew exactly how to captivate an audience and how to hide her darkest secrets hidden in plain sight. However, behind that carefully crafted image lurked something that was far more sinister, including a festering obsession, a plan for revenge, and blood spilled on federal grounds. Unfortunately, that is where Matthew Dunmire enters the story. A man who was not only a beloved friend and father, but also someone who had his own shadowy past. Whatever lay between these two, and whatever messy history they shared, it would ultimately create a monster in Chelsea. And not only would her actions result in multiple deaths, but it would also force long-forgotten secrets right back into the spotlight. Hi there folks, my name is Adrian, and welcome back to Coffeehouse Crime. And today, do I have a story for you? This one has got everything your mother warned you about. A military veteran turned OnlyFans model, a secret revenge plot that had been brewing for years, and a murder in a national park. Oh, and also a Facebook post that basically gave the entire story away before it even happened. So top up your coffee, silence that phone, and maybe lock your front doors for good measure. On that note, please grab yourself a coffee, and let's caffeinate while we investigate. This is the case of Selena Savage. Welcome to Ohio, folks. Today, we begin near the city of Hudson, and with a man named Matthew. Matthew Dunmire was, in many ways, your typical Ohio guy. At the age of 31, he was a free spirit, someone who loved music, played guitar, and cherished time with his friends. Originally from Virginia, those who knew Matthew described him as selfless, loyal to a fault, and always the first to lend a hand when someone needed help. Born on November the 26th, 1989, to his mother Tommy Lynn, Matthew was just a happy and cheerful boy. He was goofy, loved listening to Frank Zappa with his father, and found his guitar at a very young age. He also shared a deep bond with his circle of friends, most of whom were just as passionate about music as he was. And moving into his adulthood, with a long-term partner, 2 kids, and a solid crew he saw almost every day, well, Matthew seemed happily grounded in his small town just outside of Hudson, Ohio. Which is why, when he suddenly stopped responding to all text messages and didn't show up like he usually would, people knew that something was wrong. On the morning of March the 6th, 2021, Matthew disappeared under abnormal conditions. However, the real story began the evening before, on March the 5th. It was over drinks at the Tiki Underground, a local bar that he would often go to with his friends and co-workers, that Matthew said that he had plans for the weekend. He explained that a friend from Virginia was passing through Ohio, and so the two had decided to catch up. But rather than meet for dinner or coffee, they instead booked an Airbnb 40 miles north of Hudson, where they planned to spend the night together and then take a walk the following day. At around 6 p.m. that evening, and while still sharing a drink with friends, Matthew's phone lit up with a text message. He glanced down and then looked up and said to his friends that a so-called girl he knew online was here. That is when he stood up, grabbed his coat, and made his way outside. Wanting to be polite, his supervisor followed him, stepping outside to say goodbye for the weekend. The two exchanged a few words outside before then shaking hands. Meanwhile, his supervisor noticed a white smart car idling in the parking lot, its rear lights glowing in the dusky darkness. The car was for Matthew, and behind the wheel was a woman with brown hair. His supervisor couldn't make out much else, but Matthew did appear to be happy when he saw her. He then waved goodbye to his supervisor, got into the passenger seat, and then, just like that, the car pulled away, heading north along Akron-Cleveland Road and towards the big city. Now, at the time, it did seem like this was just another farewell. However, little did his supervisor know that he would be the last of Matthew's loved ones to ever see him alive. Although Matthew remained reachable that evening and even into the next morning, his messages would eventually stop. In fact, his final message was sent at 10:29 to his girlfriend, simply saying, "Okay, I'll see you in a little while." Wherever Matthew was at that moment in time, it is clear that he intended to return home later that day. But the thing is, he never did. He didn't reply, didn't call, and never came back. As the day wore on, his girlfriend, who, by the way, was already upset with him, grew concerned. I mean, Matt wasn't responding to any of her messages. But now, his friends were also saying that they couldn't get a hold of him either. And by the next day, well, that concern grew into fear. This was not like Matt at all. I mean, he had 2 kids at home after all, and all of those who knew him knew that he would not leave them hanging. Now, obviously, it is quite safe to say that his colleagues were already quite curious about this mysterious woman. I mean, it's not normal to go out of town with an old friend and then never return. And there were many questions onto why he was doing this in the first place. And now, his friends, they were openly alarmed. Who was she? And more urgently, what happened after she picked Matthew up? This mysterious woman's name was Chelsea Perkins, and it turns out that she was a high school friend of Matthew's back when he lived in Virginia. It's unclear how close the two of them were back then, but what we do know is that the two did in fact know each other, and their connection would prove to be pivotal only several years later. After graduating in the year 2009, Chelsea made a decisive move to enlist into the US Coast Guard. By the age of 19, she was stationed at Coast Guard Station Houston in Texas, where she worked as a small boat crew member and held the rank of seaman. Her military service was rather short-lived, however, lasting only 3 years until her departure in March of 2012. But it turns out that her time there would not be entirely fruitless, because while in the US Coast Guard, she met and then eventually fell in love with a fellow service member. The couple married a couple of years later, before then having 2 children and settling down in Northern Virginia. So far so good, and to the outside world, it seemed like a stable and respectable life. But behind closed doors and soon to be very public, Chelsea's lifestyle was transforming into something that no uniform could contain. And by no uniform, I mean quite literally no uniform, because Chelsea had made the decision to become an OnlyFans model. Now look, can I be really honest with you here for a minute, but do you know how hard it is to try and research an OnlyFans model without it getting a little bit risky? All I wanted was a bit of historical background and maybe a few pictures of her face. But Chelsea, she definitely had other ideas. So let's just say that now my eyeballs are in therapy and my search history needs a priest. To put this another way, after leaving the military, Chelsea did a full career pivot into the adult entertainment industry, rebranding herself as a porn model under the name Selena Savage. Now listen guys, I know you're curious, but don't go typing that name into Google. I'm serious, and I'm watching you. Focusing on the more PG-friendly version of Chelsea, she still has an active Instagram account under the name of Selena Savage Official, where she would previously promote her, content and other various life updates. From there, you can see that she likes motorbikes, hairless cats, and tattoos. And despite now operating in a very different world from the military, it does look like that she managed to leverage her online persona into a new source of income and attention. By early 2021, and at the same time that Matthew disappeared, she was a wife and a mother of 2 children, while online, she went by the name of Selena Savage. Friends and those who knew Chelsea described her as a very expressive person, who at times had somewhat of a bad behavioral reputation. A former classmate of hers from the Coast Guard described her as insane, while another former shipmate of hers described her as bizarre. However, it is important to note here that at the time, she had no recorded criminal incidents and no violent behavior on record before the year 2021. There is no known prior criminal history here, no arrests, no charges, and no civil lawsuits. It appears that after Matthew moved away from Virginia and to Ohio, he and Chelsea slowly drifted apart. Their connection, for whatever it once was, faded. That would be until a brief encounter in the year 2017. Now, we will get to the significance of that encounter soon, but for now, it's worth realizing that from that point onwards, they stopped speaking altogether. 4 years passed, and then in February of 2021, that changed yet again. During the icy stretch of that winter, Chelsea decided to add Matthew back on Facebook. It was a move that seemed casual and maybe even a little nostalgic. The two began to talk, and Chelsea mentioned to Matthew that she had plans to travel through Cleveland in only a few days' time. She told him that she was heading northwest of Detroit for a tattoo appointment, and since she would be in the area, well, they should catch up. Matthew agreed. I mean, sure, why not? It sounded simple enough. just two old acquaintances reconnecting for the weekend. But of course, that weekend would be the last time that anyone ever saw him alive. While both friends and co-workers knew that he was meeting someone, either an old friend or a woman that he'd met online, nobody actually knew her name. There were no contact details to remember, and no ways to trace him or his friend. And so, when Matthew stopped responding, well, panic began to set in, and then he was officially reported as missing. But of course, with no leads and no trail to follow, nobody had any idea where he had gone. That would be until only 3 days later. At 11 AM on March the 9th, 2021, officers from the Valley View Police Department were dispatched to the Terra Vista Natural Study Area inside Cuyahoga Valley National Park. Hikers had stumbled upon a very gruesome discovery. Just off the trail and near an old cemetery, they found the body of a young adult male. The victim appeared to be dressed in all black, wearing fingerless gloves, a leather jacket, a hoodie, jeans, and boots. Lying beside him was a half-empty bottle of Aquafina, and inside his pocket, officers found his ID, which sadly would confirm that it was Matthew Dunmire. Although his body was then prepared for autopsy, it was already obvious what had killed him. Officers observed a single gunshot wound to the back of his head, therefore ruling that this was a homicide and likely not in self-defense. When his family and friends learned of the news, that grief was sure to hit hard, and the sadness rippled through his community. But no one took it harder than his mother, Tommy Lynn, who quite clearly was shattered more than anyone realized. And trust me, there is more to this story coming up. As the reality of his death started to sink in, attention quickly turned to that mysterious woman, the one that he'd told everybody that he was with that weekend. Everyone who heard about her had the same burning questions. Who was she? Why was Matthew at the cemetery with her? And what happened between them? Now, at that point in time, nobody had the answers, but thankfully, the FBI were just about to get involved. And when they did, and eventually solved the case, let me tell you, they were surprised. But before we get there, let's first talk a little bit more about Chelsea, because it's not like an old friend would have a motive for murder, right? Well, sadly, wrong. In 2017, Chelsea went to the police with a very disturbing claim. She reported that Matthew had sexually assaulted her and that she wanted to press charges. Now, the details surrounding this allegation are still unclear to this day, but it does seem that the authorities investigated her claim and ultimately determined that there was not enough evidence to pursue charges, not even circumstantially. Not to say that it didn't happen, of course, but officers found nothing. Needless to say, Matthew denied the allegation, and not just in passing either, because those close to him say that he was utterly stunned, shaken, and horrified by the accusation. He claimed that it was entirely consensual, and that she must be lying for her own benefit. His friends were also shocked by the news. They described him as a gentle and laid-back man, the kind of guy who wouldn't hurt a fly. So, what really happened? The truth is that we don't know, and we never will. But what we can say is that moment clearly stuck with Chelsea. It lingered and festered, and those close to her would later say that she could never move past this incident. They say that she was haunted by the belief that Matthew had gotten away with something terrible. So, despite it initially sounding like an outrageous leap, it turns out that Chelsea did actually have a motive after all. Beneath the surface of their messy encounter lay a resentment that never really died. But here is the $1 million question. Could the FBI prove it? Well, as it turns out, yes, and the evidence amounts to laughable levels. On the evening of March the 5th, and at 5:46 PM, security cameras at an Ohio Turnpike toll plaza caught a glimpse of something interesting, that being a white smart car slipping through the Akron exit. Now, if you're from the area, you will know that this leads towards the Tiki Underground Bar, which is precisely where Matthew just happened to be that night. Only a few minutes later, at 6 PM, Matthew got that text message. He then turned to his co-workers, said goodbye, and stepped outside with his supervisor. The supervisor would later tell the investigators that he watched Matthew climb into a small white or silver car, which seemed to be driven by a woman with brown hair. The bar's surveillance cameras would later confirm this. And for those still wondering if this really was Chelsea, well, license plate trackers would later match the car to her husband, who, out of respect, will have his identity kept private. About 15 minutes later, and just down the road at a BP gas station, that same small white car would show up on another surveillance camera. Only a few seconds later, Matthew was seen stepping inside to buy cigarettes, a red canned drink, and a bottle of Aquafina, which, as we know, would later become crucial evidence to this case. Multiple surveillance cameras, license plate readers, and GPS data would all confirm that the two then headed north together, eventually arriving at an Airbnb located on Ashbury Avenue on the eastern side of Cleveland, Ohio. The Airbnb in question was reserved under the name of Chelsea Perkins, with a credit card under her name also being used. Not subtle at all, hey? Later that evening, a surveillance camera from a Verizon store showed the two entering a Potbelly sandwich shop together. After that, the two then headed back to their Airbnb, with nearby cell towers holding a consistent record of the two of them. The following morning, at 9:03 a.m., Matthew texted his girlfriend to say, "I'm guessing you don't miss me, and I bet you're mad with me. I pissed this chick off anyway, so I hope you're happy." At 11:09 a.m., he then pulled up Google Maps and typed in directions to the Terra Vista Natural Study Area, a quiet pocket of trails which are tucked away inside Cuyahoga Valley National Park. And by 9:45 a.m., GPS data confirmed that he had arrived. Cell towers would also confirm that Chelsea was there too, with her device pinging off a cell tower at 9:59 a.m. While nobody can say for sure what precisely happened between the two under that canopy of trees, what we do know is that at 10:29 a.m, Matthew sent a final text message to his girlfriend, simply reading, "Okay, I'll see you in a little while." Except he wouldn't, because not long after that, Matthew vanished for good. Chelsea and Matthew may have remained in privacy visually, but only a couple of minutes later, a couple heard a gunshot echoing through the trees. Fearing for their safety, they turned around and darted towards the car park, and when they eventually got there, what do you think they saw? It was Chelsea's white smart car. Only a few minutes later, another couple who were completely unaware of the commotion arrived at the car park, and once they got out of the car and walked up the trail, they saw Chelsea near the cemetery, which, by the way, was pretty much exactly where Matthew's body was found. So now, there wasn't just 2 but 4 people that could now pin Chelsea at the exact time and place that Matthew was murdered. However, this is where it gets really interesting. Do you remember that bottle of water that Matthew bought at the gas station? Well, it turns out that he'd actually brought that with him to the cemetery, with investigators later finding it next to his body. And when they tested it, they found that it contained both Matthew's and Chelsea's DNA. And if you think that's bad enough, well, it only gets worse, because her DNA wasn't only found on that bottle, but also under his fingernails and all over his pubic hair. So, I guess you could say it's the physical evidence that really turned heads. It is also worth highlighting here that the bullet found in the back of Matthew's skull was a 9mm round, and the gun that was licensed underneath Chelsea's name was a 9mm Springfield Armory. So, what did Chelsea do after Matthew was gone? Well, the road keeps talking, and it turns out that she really did go to that tattoo parlor. Turnpike Easy Pass records show that she was traveling northbound by 1 p.m. She then slipped onto the Ohio Turnpike at North Ridgeville and then headed west, straight towards Toledo. From Toledo, she then crossed state lines into Michigan, before then eventually arriving at Family Inc. And while Matthew's body lay lifeless in the park, Chelsea celebrated by getting herself a brand new tattoo, kind of like a trophy after her horrific actions. She would even talk about it on Instagram, posting a photo with the caption, "What a great weekend. I got a little blast from the babe in her sick-ass new shop. So proud." And yes, by the way, it does mean that this picture of Chelsea was taken only hours after she murdered another human. The following day, more surveillance cameras and plate checkers would track her driving all the way back home, before then carrying on with her life as if nothing had happened. But fast forward to the end of the month on March the 30th, investigators were done playing nice, and that is when they showed up at Chelsea's home in Arlington with a search warrant in hand. Thankfully, what they found inside was all they had hoped for, because hidden away in a backpack was a Springfield Armory 9mm pistol with her ID card right beside it. Forensic experts then compared the bullet pulled from Matthew's skull to rounds fired from Chelsea's handgun, and the markings left behind were so eerily similar to the fatal bullet that it was impossible to ignore. Oh, and by the way, here is something that I almost forgot to point out. But only 3 days before the murder, Chelsea jumped on Facebook and posted, "Dead men tell no tale." I mean, that is a little too on the nose if you ask me. And guess what? But that was actually posted on the same day that she reconnected with Matthew. So now, the police had, well, pretty much everything you'd expect in a rock-solid case. Of course, that being multiple witnesses, DNA, a murder weapon, and a motive far darker than most people could stomach. However, despite having all of that stacked against her, the detectives hesitated to arrest her. Maybe they were just being cautious, or maybe they wanted more time. The bottom line is, though, that for now, Chelsea walked free. And this is where our story twists and turns into a very bizarre nightmare. Matthew's mother, Tommy Lynn, was consumed by grief because, well, her son was dead. Yet, with every day that passed, she knew that his killer was out there somewhere living their best life. And so, when the police hesitated to arrest the person they believed murdered her son, Tommy Lynn flipped out, and instead she decided that she would take justice into her own hands. So, this is when Tommy decided to launch her own investigation instead. However, as Tommy dug deeper into her son's case, her mental health slowly began to unravel. She eventually convinced herself that it must be one of Matt's ex-girlfriends that was behind his murder. And to be fair, she was half right. But this burden of trying to uncover the truth would slowly begin to consume her. Sleepless nights turned into her new normal, and she spent countless hours poring over every scrap of evidence, chasing leads, and replaying what-ifs in her mind. The deeper she went, the more isolated she became. Friends started to drift away, and the family worried that they couldn't reach her. Her obsession with solving her son's case slowly eclipsed everything, until one day, that obsession turned into a plan far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. Together and with her husband, she planned an act of revenge so desperate that it barely felt real. She purchased a fake UPS uniform, loaded up the family car, and then drove all the way to Washington, D.C., to what they believed was Matthew's killer's doorstep. When Tommy knocked on that front door, her hands were trembling so violently that she could barely keep her grip on the gun, which was hidden underneath her delivery jacket. She had now made up her mind. The woman who killed her son would now have to pay in blood, and that came at the cost of 2 bullets to the stomach. But fate, or maybe just a cruel twist of tragedy, seemed to have other plans instead, because that woman who opened the front door, that was not Chelsea Perkins. Not even close. And although she may have had some faint resemblance towards Chelsea, she was a completely innocent stranger, and someone who had no connection in Matthew's death. Tommy Lynn had made a terrible mistake and had shot the wrong person. And now, with a gun in her hand and in a stranger's hallway, her revenge came crashing down around her. Matthew's mother then fled the scene, and of course, the police were right behind her, but unfortunately, it was already too late. Tommy Lynn was convinced that there was no way out of this, and so she did the unthinkable. She grabbed her gun, raised it to her head, and then pulled the trigger. In an instant, the Dunmire family lost not just a son, but a mother too, a second life that was swallowed by the same darkness that started it all. And as for Chelsea, well, her story wasn't finished yet. Although she carried on as if nothing had happened, posting on Instagram in her skimpy outfits, and in other outfits like this, she was now on borrowed time. On December the 9th of 2021, Chelsea was finally arrested on suspicion of murder. Neighbors watched from behind curtains as she was led away in handcuffs, apparently looking just as stone-faced and silent as she did at the cemetery. Down at the station, detectives finally interviewed her. They laid out the facts, including the smart car, the gas station water bottle, the DNA found on Matthew, and the bullet that matched so perfectly. However, Chelsea decided to stick to her story and denied any involvement whatsoever. She swore that she did not kill Matthew, and that she couldn't explain her DNA which was found on his body. Many of her friends were shocked by the news. I mean, Chelsea openly hated Matthew, sure, but murder? That was a surprise. There were no major red flags, she had no criminal record and no history of violence, and hadn't been diagnosed with anything either. On paper, she did appear to be a stable person, even if that did include her double life as Selena Savage. And now that I think about it, the surname really did not work in her favour. Detectives were convinced this would be an easy open and shut case. After all, Chelsea didn't just snap in an undocumented fashion, she planned every step. She booked an Airbnb, drove more than 300 miles to meet him, and then even scheduled a tattoo appointment for after the murder. To investigators, it all pointed towards one thing: cold-blooded, premeditated murder. After being arrested, Chelsea was ultimately denied bail, meaning she had no choice but to sit in a jail cell until her trial. But before that would begin, the prosecution offered her a deal: a sentence of 27 to 31 years behind bars if she were to admit to murdering Matthew. If Chelsea had taken this offer, then she would be free again by the time she turned 65. However, she would ultimately refuse this plea deal and then stand by her own story, but only for a short while. Because eventually she had a change of heart, and on May the 27th, 2025, Chelsea Perkins pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, unfortunately excluding first degree. It's interesting, but if the court accepts this plea agreement, then she will spend 20 to 25 years behind bars, which actually is a 25% cut to the first plea deal that she rejected. Now, if I had to hazard a guess, I would probably say that Chelsea realized that the evidence was simply so strong that there was no way she would win this. So I've known about this story for probably 3 weeks now, and if I'm honest with you, every time I think about it, it just stops me dead in my tracks. From Coast Guard to OnlyFans murder, then to convicted killer. What a slide. It's just absolutely crazy. And if that wasn't enough already, throwing Tommy Lynn's revenge and then death into the mix, well, now we've got a script that even Hollywood would call a bit much. Chelsea has always maintained that the main motive was revenge, which, okay, fair enough. Maybe not to that degree, but still, fair enough. But I can't be the only one thinking this. Why did she sleep with him that night? With her DNA being found on Matthew's private region, there is no room for doubt here. The two were intimate shortly before she pulled the trigger, which boggles my mind a little bit because, well, parenthood aside, Chelsea claimed that he'd assaulted her only a few years prior. And look, I'm not here to question whether it happened or not because, quite frankly, I have no authority to do so. I do have one question for you. If that were to happen to you, would you ever in a million years sleep with that person again? It's just another twist in this story that makes it so messy and unpredictable. Regardless of what you believe, one thing is clear, that Chelsea had two lives. There was the life that she showed the world, that being a smiling face, a new tattoo, snapshots of ordinary moments and not so family-friendly moments. And then there was the darker side of her too, the side where she determined that justice would not be handed down by a judge, but taken by force on her own terms instead. To be blunt, it is quite hard to believe that she actually believed that she would get away with his death too. I mean, her plot contained not one, but several glaring holes. And I still can't wrap my head around this photo, which was taken the very day she murdered Matthew. In fact, there are dozens more photos after it. And it's kind of unsettling to realize that, even after pulling that trigger, she just seemed to carry on, smiling for selfies, posing for the camera, and living like nothing ever happened. It's moments like this that remind me that sometimes the scariest of monsters don't actually look like monsters at all. Well, maybe just a little bit. And on that note, folks, I'm going to wrap up this video here, but I genuinely want to know what you think about this one. Do you think it was revenge, or just cold-blooded murder? Or do you think it was something even more complicated? Please share your thoughts down below. Thank you so much for making it this far today, folks. I really do appreciate you being here. And if you haven't yet, please do slap that subscribe button. It really does help me out. As always, I'll see you in the next video, which will be next week now. But until that moment arrives, remember to look after yourselves, look after each other, and of course, stay curious. Thank you, and goodbye.